Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Christopher Bonner's presentation this evening, Against the Law, Forms of African-American Politics. My name is Piali Callahan, and I'm an instructor and research specialist at Howard County Library System. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Jessica Seipel. We are honored to have with us today Dr. Christopher Bonner. Dr. Bonner specializes in African-American history and the 19th century United States. He teaches African-American history at the University of Maryland, College Park. He published his first book, Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship, in 2020. His work has also appeared in the collection, New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition, 2018. And at Black Perspectives, the blog for the African-American Intellectual History Society. Originally from Chesapeake, Virginia, he earned his BA from Howard University and his PhD from Yale University. Tonight, please use our question and answer feature and our chat feature to ask any questions that you might have during the presentation, and Dr. Bonner will answer them after his presentation. And with that, we invite Dr. Christopher Bonner to our virtual stage tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, Piale. Thanks, Jessica. It's fun to be on this virtual stage and to have this opportunity to talk to y'all. I'm really glad. Well, first, thanks to everybody who came out on this Thursday evening. I know this is a busy time of the year, so I appreciate the time, and I hope that this is fruitful for y'all and for me. As Piali mentioned, I'm really happy to take questions once we wrap up. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. And I'll go ahead and jump in. So what I'm going to do today is tell two stories that I hope will help to illuminate some of the complexities of Black politics in the early 19th century. The first of these stories is about one person's struggle to secure the right to vote in the antebellum North. And the second is about other kinds of Black political activity in the same time period, in the decades before the Civil War. So my hope is that by looking at different stories about different forms of politics, I can give you a big picture sense of what Black politics was during the 19th century. And so this is Against the Law, Forms of African-American Politics. In his adolescent years, Willis Augustus Hodges must have spent many evenings with a sense of foreboding, worried about the violence that might be visited upon his family once he fell asleep. Hodges was born to free African-American parents in 1815 in Princess Anne County, Virginia, near the state's Atlantic coast and just above the North Carolina border. In the late 1820s and early 1830s, free Black people in this area endured waves of violent attacks at the hands of white bandits who invaded homes, assaulted people, and shot livestock. This violence might have been particularly prevalent in the aftermath of Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion, during which enslaved people killed 55 white Virginians. That uprising sparked violent retribution at the hands of state authorities and the white population more generally. Willis Hodges later reflected on this campaign of terror that white bandits conducted. No free person of color within their reach was safe in person or property, he wrote, for these wolves had tasted human blood and liked it too well to let it alone. Hodges said leading white Virginians had offered a clear message alongside the attacks. They advised us, if we ever wish to enjoy happiness and become men in every sense of the word, to leave the United States. Hodges' parents owned about 200 acres of land, and they insisted on remaining in Virginia. But Willis looked elsewhere in search of home. He moved to New York, and over the next 2 decades, he organized protest meetings, participated in political conventions, contributed to newspapers, built a Black community upstate, and was elected to local office. The terror inflicted on families like the Hodges in Virginia was intended to make the United States a white man's republic. Hodges spent the next decades contesting that vision of his native country and working to change the legal terms of his life. Willis Hodges' story is a key part of my book, Remaking the Republic. Free Black Americans' central political concern was to change the legal circumstances of their lives. So when I talk about the book, often I like to start out by asking a question. What does citizenship mean to you? What does it mean to say that a person is a citizen? So typically when I ask these kinds of questions, I get a wide range of responses. People might talk about specific rights. They might mention broader benefits of citizen status, things like access to the law or access to the physical territory of a nation. Or they might talk about more intangible things, things like belonging. Citizenship is contested ground. But even when people don't agree on what exactly citizenship means, they do tend to have strong ideas about it. People do seem to agree that citizenship is a significant marker of a person's legal identity. And people seem to believe or agree that citizenship is a thing worth fighting for. None of these qualities of citizenship are new. Since the beginning of the United States, people have disagreed about the precise terms of citizen status, even when they agreed that it was a thing that was worth fighting for. So my book tells a series of stories about Black Americans pushing their way into that fight in the early 19th century. A little context about Black life in this time period. After the American Revolution, several northern states took steps to gradually abolish slavery. New York's gradual abolition law said that enslaved people born after the 4th of July in 1799 would be free when they reached age 25 if they were women, or age 28 if they were men. So these kinds of laws slowly, that time gap, 25 or 28 years, that should suggest how slowly these kinds of laws worked. They slowly created a free Black population in the North. But at the same time that this was happening, lawmakers limited Black freedom in really significant ways. The US Congress excluded Black men from the military, and many states barred Black men from militias. Ohio had some of the most extreme anti-Black laws. Ohio required free Black people to pay a $500 bond before they could settle in the state. New York allowed Black men to vote, but only if they owned $250 worth of real estate. So not only was that a significant amount of money, but the fact that it was real estate was really restrictive because most Black people were renters in New York. Faced with these restrictions, Black people turned to citizenship in pursuit of justice. The word citizen appeared 11 times in the original US Constitution, and you can see some of its uses here. One of the most significant of those uses is that it protects an undefined set of privileges and immunities. The document implied that citizenship could be an important factor in determining a person's legal life, but it didn't name the rights or obligations of citizen status. It also didn't say who could be a citizen. So this uncertainty was powerful for Black activists. No law said African Americans could not be citizens. So Black people insisted that they were, and they demanded legal protections under the status. Citizenship became a flexible and potent tool for Black activists. And when they claimed rights as citizens, they contributed to ongoing conversations about the relationships linking individuals and governments in the United States. This is the process I refer to in my book's title. Black folks were remaking the Republic. They were doing work that could change the nation's legal structures. And they were doing this at a critical time when those structures were still new and developing. Much of Black politics in the early 19th century was about words, about public statements with people demanding legal change. Willis Hodges brings together that politics of language with a politics of action. As a convention delegate and a newspaper contributor, Hodges' activism centered on his words, but he also moved to upstate New York. And there he could experience the belonging that he and other Black people said citizenship should entail. Hodges' story shows us three things. It illuminates some of the techniques of 19th century Black politics. It reflects the usefulness of citizenship as a political tool. And at the same time, it shows us the limitations of Black politics that was dedicated to inclusion above all else. Willis Hodges moved to Manhattan in 1833, and he was immediately disappointed at the state of Black freedom in the North. He was surprised to see that most Black New Yorkers were struggling to support themselves with working in service positions. They were waiters, cooks, or dock workers. After he spent his first several months in the city scraping by with odd jobs, he came to understand the barriers to finding more lucrative work. The fact that New York restricted Black voting rights was just one part of a much bigger problem of prejudice in the state. Eventually, Hodges was able to find stable work, carting goods for builders in the city. New York then, as it is now, was a sort of bustling commercial hub. There was a lot of construction going on, a lot of commerce, a lot of moving of stuff. And so Hodges got good work doing that moving. Eventually, with this work, Hodges was able to save enough money to open a grocery store. And he partnered in that venture with one of his brothers who had also left Virginia and joined him in the North. So as Hodges is working and trying to survive, he's coming to understand the legal and economic problems Black New Yorkers faced, and he took steps to try to improve Black life in the state. He attended abolitionist lectures, and he immersed himself in a culture of Black protest. As a child, he had learned to read in Virginia. Before that state's lawmakers outlawed Black literacy. That was one of the responses to Nat Turner's rebellion, was a measure to restrict or really to ban Black people from learning to read in the state. Hodges once said, "I'd never been able to read much." But despite that claim, he actually subscribed to 3 different newspapers while he lived in New York. And one of them was titled The Colored American, which was edited and published by Samuel Cornish. This newspaper was a critical tool for antebellum Black politics. Cornish debuted the paper in 1837, and you're seeing here one of its earliest issues. The title of the paper asserted the main purpose. Cornish wanted to show that Black people belonged in the United States. He demanded access to and equality in the nation. The ambiguous and powerful word citizenship was a key part of his work. In the first issue of the newspaper, Cornish printed excerpts from the debates of the New York Constitutional Convention, which had restricted Black voting rights. In those debates, the fact that they were debates really is what is important. Some lawmakers said Black men should be recognized as citizens. And those lawmakers said that because of that, African Americans should have a political voice. Cornish printed those comments in support of Black rights. And he felt that this was really strong evidence to show that Black people were entitled to rights as citizens. So these claims from lawmakers in support of Black rights, those went on the front page of one of the first issues of this newspaper. So you might be able to imagine Willis Hodges sitting at home in the evenings after work, relaxing and reading this newspaper. But we don't have to rely solely on Cornish's work to understand Hodges's beliefs. Subscribing to the Colored American was just one part of Hodges's plunge into the Black political culture of the North. By 1840, he had moved to what was then an up-and-coming community, Williamsburg, Brooklyn. He started organizing among his fellow Black residents there, and they chose him as their representative at the 1840 Black State Convention, which was held in Albany, New York. The Black conventions were meetings that took place across the North, organized in certain states and also across the nation. So people would gather and talk about the problems they faced, and then they would try to agree on public statements that they could issue to demand change. Hodges and other delegates at the 1840 convention, for instance, one of the things that they did, they issued a forceful condemnation of the state's law that restricted Black men's voting rights. They said that it was a violation of justice because it deprived us of those rights which should have been enjoyed in common by all native-born citizens. Hodges also went to and participated in a Black convention in 1841, and there he started outlining this new set of ideas about a different Black future. Willis Hodges urged Black people to essentially to become farmers. If Black New Yorkers moved upstate, if they acquired affordable land of their own, then there they might be freed from the economic struggle of New York City. His argument paralleled some of what Samuel Cornish printed in The Colored American. Cornish urged Black people to embrace new lives as farmers in pursuit of economic and political power. And so under the headline, you see here, the headline, The Importance of Agricultural Pursuits, Cornish wrote, "In our large cities, we are passed by as not at all incorporated in the body politic." So the vision here is that if Black folks left urban areas and took up farming, they would be able to influence their communities. Cornish wrote that Black farmers would cultivate America's fertile garden. And by doing this, they would gain some influence in their own country. So leaving New York would allow Black people, not only would it allow them to support themselves in ways that they were struggling to do in the city, but they might also be able to be a part of the process of building new and developing communities. There's this idea among Black activists that's very similar to the idea among a lot of white Americans at the time, that the West, that places outside of the major cities of the East, that all those places were places of opportunity. For Cornish and for Hodges and others, that part of that opportunity was a political opportunity. If they went out of the cities, Black people might be able to shape new local laws as they were developing. And they might be able to ensure that Black equality was embedded in those laws. So Black agrarianism, this investment in Black farming, Black agricultural pursuits, this could be a step toward remaking the legal order in the state and beyond. Cornish, in the Colored American, advertised farmland for sale in Western New York. And he urged readers to move upstate and help make their children useful and virtuous citizens. In the late 1840s, Cornish was no longer publishing the Colored American, but Hodges took up the work of printing a newspaper for Black New York. He established a paper titled The Ram's Horn. The paper debuted in January 1847, and it was published for nearly the entire year. But despite this relatively long run, I've only been able to find one issue that survives in the archives. And you can see here that that issue is in really poor condition. Some of it is pretty readable. And one of the things that is in this issue is a single item signed with the initials W.A.H. Presumably this is Willis Augustus Hodges. In this news item, Hodges announced a meeting of the New York Emigration Association. This is a group that was planning to establish a Black settlement in upstate New York. So here we can see the combination really, really vividly, the combination of words and action. Hodges is writing in this newspaper, and he's writing about the movement of Black people. Hodges said that he was convinced something besides speechifying had to be done if we wanted our rights. After a series of meetings of the Immigration Association, in 1848, Hodges joined with 8 Black families, left Brooklyn, and he settled on 40 acres in the Adirondack Mountains. These Black folks made their homes on land provided by the wealthy white abolitionist Garrett Smith. Smith offered 3,000 Black New Yorkers land upstate, and he hoped that these land grants would make it possible for more African-American men to vote, and that flourishing free Black communities might convince white people that slavery was unjust. Smith was an abolitionist to the core. He thought the settlement could help loosen the bonds of the enslaved. Any Black person between the ages of 21 and 60 who didn't already own land and, importantly, was not a drunkard would be eligible for a 40 to 60 acre plot. Smith expressed serious concerns about drinking among Black New Yorkers. "I'm grieved to learn that intemperance has made such havoc among the colored people of the state. Vain and worse than vain will be my grant of land to a drunkard." Black activists were recruiting settlers to the Smith lands, and in that process, they made clear that the most important requirement was total abstinence from all intoxicating drinks. And I don't have a photo of it here, but one of the things that's interesting about that document is that line, total abstinence from all intoxicating drinks, that's in all caps in the actual document. It was really, really important. So after saying that, the recruiters lied to their readers. The grant to you is free, untrammeled, unconditional, they wrote. But the grant was not at all unconditional. Garrett Smith was looking for a particular type of settler. Smith's land grants implied that the right to vote should only be available to certain Black people, people who followed a specific, narrow moral path. Willis Hodges apparently fit the bill. He made his home in Franklin County, and while he lived there, he was elected to the position of town collector. I'm not exactly sure what his role was in that position, but it's a really incredible turn in this story. His election offered a direct form of government engagement. It affirmed his legal position in the state and in the nation. Settling on the Smith lands allowed Hodges to secure that position. So Hodges' story is a striking reflection of Black politics in action during the 19th century. He embodied ideas about the significance of formal political power and the avenues Black people should travel to attain. In Franklin County, Hodges challenged the belief that the United States was a country intended to be ruled by white men. But at the same time that Hodges illuminates the legal possibilities of Black life, it's important to keep in mind how rare his experience was. He was born to free parents who were able to provide a basic education, which was not typical for Black Southern children. He also had enough disposable income to relocate to New York and then to move again upstate in search of this political influence. His opportunities were rare, and those rare opportunities made it possible for Hodges to gain formal political voice. So when we look at the story in this light, through its rarity, we can see that what Hodges won was a contingent citizenship. The status he secured in Franklin County was not available equally to African Americans. Black people made arguments about the terms of citizenship as they struggled to secure rights, but their arguments were often constrained by the idea that they had to prove themselves worthy of those rights. Jumping the high hurdle that the state erected on the path to Black voting rights did not challenge the racial inequality at the heart of the law. When Hodges moved to the Adirondack Mountains and when he renounced all intoxicating drinks, he assumed a burden, the burden of his Blackness. He asked other African Americans to do the same, to navigate the world under the legal weight of racism. And so Hodges' story reveals one of the critical differences between legal protection and liberation. Hodges had the right to vote, but he didn't have equality. So Hodges asserted that he was a citizen, but his path to inclusion required him to take on a set of racist and moralizing restrictions. The right to vote was the most important political aspiration for Willis Hodges and for many other African Americans, many other free African Americans. Some Black people hoped that being included in the lawmaking process would provide for them a way to get all of the other legal protections they wanted. But Black politics is and was complex. People were thinking about far more than just the right to vote. I'd like to tell another story now about a man named William Dixon that offers another angle on the forms of African American politics. Dixon's story requires us to look beyond the vote. It offers a fuller sense of Black people's concerns and their political strategies in the early 19th century. William Dixon's name emerged in the historical record after he was arrested in New York City on a spring morning in 1837. Dixon had left his home on the Bowery, headed to work, when a stranger grabbed him and brought him to face a judge at City Hall. Arriving in the courtroom, the stranger made this claim. The Black man who called himself William Dixon was actually a fugitive slave named Jake. Allegedly, Jake had run away from Baltimore doctor Walter Allender 5 years earlier in 1832. So in court, the slave catcher, this person who had been hired to recapture a fugitive, he referred to William Dixon as Allender's Jake. So the idea here is that he was a man called Jake who was owned by Walter Allender. And so he was Allender's Jake, according to the slave catcher. Authorities brought William Dixon to a cell in the crumbling jail called Bridewell, and they held him there for a week. Then on the morning of April 12th, 2 sheriffs escorted him from Bridewell to City Hall for another hearing before Judge Richard Riker. Under New York's laws, a single judge could decide whether an alleged fugitive would remain free or be sent into bondage. Judge Riker had a bad reputation among abolitionists and among Black people. He had a reputation for being a friend to slave owners. Riker often ruled in favor of the slave owners and allowed alleged fugitives to be taken to the South. Standing before Judge Riker, the accused man protested passionately. He insisted that his name was William Dixon. And he said this: "It is hard, Your Honor. It is hard to be thus treated in this land of liberty. I'm an innocent man. I'm a free man. It is hard to be torn from my family and thrust into prison like a dog. I demand justice of Your Honor." So Riker heard the man's pleas and he called for a recess to decide his fate. The sheriffs took Dixon by the arms to escort him back to his cell. New York City Hall stands today as it did on that April afternoon in the middle of an 8-acre park in Lower Manhattan. So this is a photograph that I took several years ago now, actually, when I realized that New York was the same, that City Hall was the same building that it is the same building that it was in 1837. I took a trip down and I took a tour and walked around and took some photos. And it's really one of my favorite little research trips, is like being able to walk the places that William Dixon walked. So after the hearing on April 12th, the sheriffs prepared to lead Dixon across City Hall Park to Bridewell. Flanking the captive, they walked down a grand staircase toward the building's main entrance. But as they ushered Dixon toward the doors of City Hall, they would have looked through the large windows that lined the front of the building and seen a massive crowd waiting outside. During the hearing, more than 1,000 African Americans had gathered on City Hall Plaza. The sheriffs were apparently unconcerned, but as soon as they stepped outside, the crowd surged forward. Several people attacked the sheriffs with wooden clubs. A woman at the front of the crowd pulled a knife from under her dress and handed it to Dixon. At first, Dixon wasn't sure what to do while these strangers fought for his freedom, but he overcame his shock and he ran west toward Broadway. Then he turned north to seek shelter in the busy city streets. The crowd continued to fight with the authorities. Another city official ran outside to support the sheriffs, but according to a newspaper account, a strapping Negro wench grabbed this guy in a chokehold, and a group of young Black men pretty well pummeled him and tore the coat completely off his back. Meanwhile, while this fight is going on, William Dixon kept moving north on Broadway. A man on horseback tried to stop him, but Dixon's new escort, several Black men armed with clubs, protected the fleeing prisoner. When he reached Duane Street, just a few blocks from City Hall, Dixon took cover, ducking into a coal cellar to wait out his pursuers. His freedom was short-lived. A few hours later, a witness tipped off authorities and they stormed into the cellar, seized William Dixon, and carted him back to Bridewell. So the map you're looking at here is from a similar time period from 1846. The black dot is City Hall. The green dot is the location of Bridewell, and the red dot is where Dixon was eventually recaptured. So he didn't go very far in the end in this flight. The attempt to rescue William Dixon reflected an important thread in Black and anti-slavery politics of the period. The white abolitionist Henry Clark Wright was dismayed that alleged fugitives had to work harder to prove their cases than alleged slave owners did. Wright said, "Here is the great difficulty in all cases of runaways or citizens claimed as such. The whole burden of proof is thrown upon the colored man. One Black New Yorker called people like Dixon citizens of a free state and said that if they were accused of fleeing slavery, they should be entitled to a jury trial. Vocal Black and white activists insisted that citizenship must protect free people from being sent into bondage. This rhetoric was designed to urge lawmakers to enact measures that would defend Black freedom. Unfortunately, the reality was that the legal system in which Dixon had been taken captive was designed to preserve Black slavery. The US Constitution empowered slave owners to reclaim fugitives who fled to another state. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 said slave owners could cross state lines to pursue runaways. And theoretically, that law allowed them to arrest free Black people who they accused of being fugitive slaves. The simple fact that enslaved people were so valuable meant that Black Northerners lived in a precarious freedom. They might be seized mistakenly by slave catchers, or they might be seized maliciously by kidnappers. Kidnapping endangered all Black Northerners, and that helps to explain why so many people gathered on City Hall Plaza to try to rescue William Dixon. 1,000 Black New Yorkers came out because Black New Yorkers had a history of organizing to defend their freedom. In 1835, an interracial group of abolitionists established the New York Committee of Vigilance, or the NYCV. This group called for new laws to protect free Black people, and at the same time, they helped known fugitive slaves who had come north looking for safety. They called this work practical abolition. They saw themselves as doing all sorts of concrete things to fight slavery and to fight its dangerous or harmful implications. Samuel Cornish, in addition to his work with the newspaper, was a leader in the NYCV. He had begun publishing The Colored American just a few weeks before Dixon's arrest, and so he covered the case in many of his earliest issues. Like others in the committee, Cornish said alleged fugitives should have the protection of jury trials. But the most interesting thing about Cornish's writing from this time is that he was extremely critical about the violent effort to liberate William Dixon. Cornish said the crowd was nothing more than a multitude of illiterate people. From his perspective, these folks weren't acting in a calculated way in pursuit of progress. Instead, Cornish said this crowd had become mere subjects of passion. There was some legitimacy to his concerns. There were NYCV lawyers leading William Dixon's defense. And the hope of these lawyers, the hope of Samuel Cornish, was that the lawyers could convince the judge to grant Dixon a jury trial. So ultimately, the hope was that protecting William Dixon in the courts would set a legal precedent that might protect other Black people if they faced the same problem. Cornish doubted that a mob rescue of a single man would have the same legal potential. But beyond his concerns about political tactics, Samuel Cornish was outraged that African Americans had done something he felt was uncivil. He was especially displeased that women had played prominent roles in the attempted rescue. He said those activist women had degraded themselves. And he added this: "We begged their husbands to keep them at home for the time to come and find some better occupation for them." Cornish, as you can see, addressed this message to the thoughtless part of our colored citizens. In so doing, he was promoting really narrow ideas about who could do meaningful Black political work. Black women were often denied the chance to make their voices heard in Black newspapers and public meetings during the 19th century. Men like Samuel Cornish had a lot of power in Black politics, and they had restrictive ideas about gender. Many of them simply thought political activity wasn't appropriate for women. To me, though, what's the interesting thing about this is, like, to me, one of the things that's most fascinating about this attempted rescue is that the politics that was displayed here, this kind of politics on the street, it offered a clear opportunity for Black women to express their ideas in public. They couldn't write in newspapers, typically. They couldn't take part in the same kinds of meetings that Black men did. And so this was a chance for Black women to speak out. I like thinking about the woman who stood at the front of the crowd during this rescue, the woman who reached under her dress and pulled out a knife for William Dixon. She did that because she thought it would help secure his freedom. Maybe she relished this opportunity to step outside of what many thought was proper women's work. Or maybe she had done this several times before. Maybe she had long ago rejected Cornish's ideas about acceptable women's behavior. It's tough to know her particular activist history. We don't even know her name. But what we do know is important. This woman chose to take a critical role in Dixon's rescue, and none of the people in the crowd stood in her way. Black women carved out opportunities to make their voices heard, despite some people's efforts to silence them. This woman's actions reflect some important truths about the attempted rescue. African Americans were convinced that Dixon deserved a fair hearing, but they felt pretty confident that the legal structures in place would not provide it. The mob action was a way for Black people to defend Dixon's freedom, but it was also about far more than any single Black person. Attacking sheriffs and judges on the steps of City Hall in order to liberate an alleged fugitive was a protest of the legal structures that imperiled Black freedom. Breaking the law was a critical form of Black politics. Through their actions, the crowd outside of City Hall added their voices to those calling for a different legal order in the United States, a legal order that would protect Black freedom as robustly as it had long defended slave owners' property rights. Breaking laws was one way activists highlighted injustice and demanded legal protection as citizens. And so despite what Samuel Cornish wrote, the folks who formed that mob on City Hall Plaza, these folks were far from thoughtless. I see an interesting parallel here to contemporary Black politics. Over the past several years, people across the country have gathered to protest police brutality. And often they've been motivated by videos that document police officers killing African Americans. Some of these protests have involved forms of violence, and many vocal and really powerful figures, including President Obama, have criticized protesters who don't fit with their ideas about what kinds of politics are acceptable. Here you see Obama said of the protesters, "We should condemn the few who resort to violence." This is during the summer of 2020. People made similar arguments about Black protests after uprisings in Baltimore and Ferguson in 2014 and 2015. Again, in those cases, police killed Black people, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Michael Brown in Ferguson. And activists took to the streets to denounce longstanding, unchecked police brutality. At the time, many observers condemned those movements as violent, destructive, unruly, or unproductive. We can see a couple of examples of this in our local paper, in the Washington Post. From April 2015, this phrase, "peaceful protest," shifts focus back to death of Freddie Gray. This as though violence wasn't also expressing outrage about Freddie Gray's killing. Or a column headline from the Post that begins with the premise, "Rioting makes no sense." But the violence we've seen in 2014 and 2015, and that we've seen in 2020 and 21, this violence is only senseless if we don't try to make sense of it. Violent forms of protest often reflect protesters' political thought. My sense is that many people are becoming more open to thinking critically about violence as protest. But still, vocal, prominent figures issue sweeping statements that condemn violence and dismiss its significance. To me, these dismissals sound a bit like powerful figures who try to limit Black politics to a set of forms that they feel are acceptable. The project of justice for Black people is not served by blanket criticisms of certain forms of protest. Instead, I think we should try to continue trying to understand the concerns that can produce violent, law-breaking protests. And I think we should try to take seriously the intellectual and political work that these protests can do. This is part of what I'm trying to do in my scholarship. I try to ask questions about why people turn to violence in the effort to rescue William Dixon. And if we can see political thought in the violent, unruly attempt to rescue this one man, I think we have to do the same for violent, unruly forms of politics in our current context. Violence might be protest. Lawbreaking can be politics. We should ask thoughtful questions about the roots of particular political forms. Why might Black folks choose certain avenues of political expression? What ideas might Black people convey in collective public acts of lawbreaking? In the past and in the present, African Americans have recognized that certain legal structures need to be broken in order to bring people closer to justice. So turning back to William Dixon's story, in the days after the failed rescue attempt, Dixon's trial continued. His counsel called a number of witnesses, including a white ship captain who testified that he had employed Dixon occasionally since 1831. They also called a Black barber from Philadelphia who said he had known William Dixon as a free man for 15 years. Walter Allender, who was Dixon's alleged owner, had to prove a difficult case. The slave that Allender said was called Jake had allegedly run away in 1832. So none of those witnesses could claim to have seen the man for at least 5 years. Allender's witnesses then had to prove that after all that time, they could identify one out of the 20,000 free and enslaved African Americans who lived in Baltimore. Judge Riker refused to deliver a prompt decision. He left Dixon to sit in a cell for 3 months. Maybe he spent some of that time anxious, worried that whatever decision he made might lead to more violence on the steps of City Hall. Finally, in July 1837, Dixon's lawyers secured a writ that allowed Dixon to go free on bail. Under the terms of this writ, Dixon would have to return to court if the judge called him. But in any subsequent hearings, a jury would determine his fate. This writ allowed Dixon to return to his life in New York, and it offered him an important new layer of legal protection against enslavement. It seemed that Samuel Cornish and William Dixon and the NYCB lawyers had been right to obey the law in seeking protections for Black freedom. Judge Riker responded favorably to their arguments, and the case could set a valuable precedent for protecting other alleged fugitives in the time to come. In the stories of Willis Hodges and William Dixon, we can see a lot of critical aspects of Black history and US history in the 19th century. We can see a range of African Americans' political concerns, from voting rights to personal freedom to the opportunities to have their voices heard in public. We can see that African American people chose protest strategies based on the opportunities that were available to them and the causes they felt were most urgent. We can see solidarity among Black folks as it was forming. And we can also see tensions that emerged as different African Americans chose different paths toward justice. Most broadly, we can see how people who were denied formal political rights were able to insert their voices and ideas into the spaces where laws were being made. Free African Americans insisted that they should have a voice in the lawmaking process, and they found creative ways to push their way in. In New York, some Black people changed their addresses and their lives in order to vote. Others learned the law, and they risked their lives to defend one another. These were some of the many ways African Americans made themselves heard. In New York, for a brief moment in the 1830s, members of the crowd that rescued William Dixon shaped the local lawmaking process in the same way that a Black voter living in the Adirondacks in the 1840s hoped to do at the ballot box. Before I finish up, there's a little epilogue to Dixon's story that I'd like to share. It offers another angle on the ways Black people pursued justice in this period. After he was released from jail, William Dixon lived in a state of anxiety. He could still be called back to court, or he might be arrested again, or kidnapped. His daily life was a tense experience. And perhaps no single encounter was more frightening than a chance meeting with a runaway slave from Maryland. In his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass described the morning he arrived in New York City in 1839, disembarking from a train just after he had escaped slavery in Baltimore. Douglass was lost and lonely, wandering the streets of Lower Manhattan. So he felt overjoyed when he bumped into a Black man he knew, a man he remembered from Baltimore, a man he recognized as Allender's Jake. I knew Jake well, Douglass wrote. He had heard that Dr. Allender had sent slave catchers after the runaway, but Douglass was glad to see that Jake seemed to be thriving in freedom. As you might imagine, Jake was less than pleased to run into this particular old friend. He announced to Douglass, "I am William Dixon in New York," and he quickly walked away, leaving the more recent runaway alone in an unfamiliar city. Given what Frederick Douglass wrote about this encounter, it's worth considering a few more questions about William Dixon's story. Who knew the truth of Allender's Jake? The Black New Yorkers who tried to rescue him understood how difficult it was for any African American to secure freedom through the law. Regardless of whether they knew Dixon was Jake, they knew there were limits to the justice available to him, and they took steps to challenge that reality. Did the NYCB lawyers know that they were defending an actual fugitive? If they did, then Dixon and his defense team broke the law repeatedly, brazenly, from inside of New York's City Hall. Their law-breaking helped move toward a precedent that might create new legal protections for Black freedom. The lawyers recruited witnesses, Black and white, who were willing to lie in court in an effort to protect African Americans. For all his condemnation of the attempted rescue, it seems likely that Samuel Cornish, a leader in the Vigilance Committee, also knew the truth about William Dixon. That actually might be why he was so angry about the mob. Cornish might have known just how much work had been done, how much work had been done in court, how much work had been done beforehand to prepare this man to lie. Cornish was exasperated that a mob protest might disrupt a case that had so much legal potential, a case that had been built for so long. The legal case of the runaway slave Jake appears to have involved a series of acts of lawbreaking that took place both in and outside of City Hall. Finally, why did this man lie so ardently about his freedom? And why did he seem to think that it would work? Maybe this was a simple choice for a person who was desperate to be free. William Dixon was a character, a performance of freedom that was enacted both in the courtroom and on the streets. It was a skillful performance, a high wire act of lawbreaking. His story shows us how well Black people understood the law. It shows us how effectively they manipulated and moved through legal structures, making transformative claims about citizenship, rights, and justice. In the 1830s, African Americans deftly navigated the legal landscape of New York, working in print, in court, and in the city streets to transform a fugitive slave called Allender's Jake into a free man named William Dixon. So thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm really, really, again, happy to be able to share some of this work with you this evening, and I'm happy to take any and all questions. Should I just jump into the Q&A and see what we have?
Sure. Yeah, we have a couple of questions there if you want to just.
Yeah. Let's see. The first question says, I assume Northern Blacks led in the citizenship battles because they had more relative freedom than Southern Blacks. Yes. All right. I wonder how much those in the North who may have always been free could really, this is a really great question. So the first part of the question is, were African Americans in the North, were their lives sort of relatively, at least relatively better than those of Black folks in the South? And I think the first part of that question is really important. Relatively is key here. Yes, Black folks in the North were free legally. They were not subject to the horrific structures of labor that enslaved people in the South were. But they were in many ways restricted, bound, or constrained in terms of what they could do. So they did have opportunities. Black folks in the South couldn't have newspapers. Black folks in the South couldn't form large public meetings without legal restrictions. So they did. The fact that Black politics in the North existed in the ways that it did was precisely a product of the opportunities that the North presented to them. But there is this tension. So the second part of the second question here is, how well could free Black Northerners really relate to enslaved Black people in the South? And I think that there are two ways to think about this. One is that a lot of Black folks who were living in the North and working as activists had once been enslaved or had once lived in the South. So Willis Hodges had lived in the South and suffered under the threat of racial violence and chose to leave and go to the North. So he would have remembered what Black life in the South was like. Other folks like Frederick Douglass, who became one of the leading and most prominent Black abolitionists, was a slave. And so he understood the forms and the nature, the structures of slavery. But at the same time, there's something that happens, I think, that's evident in some of the documents that shows the distance between Black Northerners and Black Southerners. One of the best examples I think of this is, and I'll try to say this briefly, in 1843, a Black abolitionist named Henry Highland Garnett writes a speech that he calls an address to the slaves. And it's not entirely clear whether Garnett actually thought that this speech would make it to the South. But part of what he says is that enslaved people in the South should, I think the phrase he uses is, go to your lordly enslavers and tell them that you refuse to work. And one of the other things that Garnett says, and a lot of abolitionists would say, is that they would pull this famous quote, anti-slavery quotation, that it's better to die free men than live slaves. And what I say when I talk about this with my students is it's really easy for a Black person in New York, where Garnett was, to say like, hey, yeah, you should die rather than be enslaved. But it's much different for a person who was actually in slavery in Virginia or Georgia or Alabama to enact that kind of politics. And so there are moments where you can see that, I don't know, there's something about Black activists that in some ways they might have sort of been or seemed a little bit out of touch with the actual concerns, the realities of Black life and Black suffering for enslaved people. So I hope that helps. I think that there are connections, but there are also disconnects. There are also tensions that are at play here. So Debbie asked the question, which I think is important. How does looting relate to political action? How does destroying property and stealing goods show political activism? Is this form of violence okay? Let me take the last point first. I don't mean to say, and I say this when I talk about this at any time, I don't want folks to leave here and say, oh, this Professor Bonner is saying violence is good, violence is okay. What I'm saying broadly is that we need to try to understand it. We need to try to think about it. And so we could think about the violence of, in Minnesota after George Floyd was killed, a major target was burned and partly destroyed. We can think about that as a kind of violence that is expressing a set of concerns, really the concern broadly being anger about inequality and injustice in the city. In the same way, we should think about the political expression that's being expressed, or the political ideas that are being expressed, let's say in the 1920s in the South, when a Black person was lynched, or when Emmett Till was murdered in 1955. The broad point that I want to make is that violence has meaning, and that we are better served by trying to understand the meanings of that violence. What we should do then, in terms of understanding or thinking about how we feel about it, is try to think about how we feel about the ideas that might be expressed. when Black folks in Minneapolis feel economic and political and legal injustice on a day-to-day basis, and they decide to attack, to burn a Target, that's something that I think, many people might say, yeah, like racial injustice is bad. Black people should be able to feel free and have access to economic opportunity. If they feel upset about that, that's a thing that I might agree with. But if white Southerners feel like Emmett Till allegedly whistling at a white woman is grounds for him to be brutally murdered, that's not something that's okay. But the broader point, again, is that we need to just try to, I think we should try to understand why people do violent things rather than simply saying violence is bad. And maybe if we think more about why people do violent things, we might understand more about the circumstances in which people live that are oppressive or restrictive or that might lead them to enact violence. And so, I also don't want to say we have to agree on this, but I think that it's useful to try to make sense of violence and the political meanings that it might entail. I see a couple of questions in the chat. Should I jump to these?
Yeah. Do you want me to read them to you, or you just can read them and answer?
I think I can read them.
Okay.
Yeah. This person is asking, could an argument be made that the decision to lie about status as an enslaved person was actually a conscious decision to reject the right of any person to assert ownership over another? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting claim, and I think that's this is the part of the broader justification of abolitionists in terms of fighting slave catchers who were sent to the North and resisting the Fugitive Slave Act and running away. The feeling among many enslaved people and the idea that a lot of abolitionists expressed was that there was no moral basis for a right to own a person. And because of that, slavery couldn't be a legal right. I think, and at some points, by the late 1850s, when Abraham Lincoln was sort of moving into his status, his work as an anti-slavery politician, one of the things that he said in the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1857, I think, was that if we think that slavery is morally wrong, there can be no right in a thing that is wrong. And so I think that is an idea that moves through a lot of anti-slavery protests. And that's what leads people to feel like it's okay to break laws because these laws are wrong. It's okay to do violence to slave catchers because they are doing things that are wrong. Frederick Douglass in the 1850s, after the more strict Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, Douglass said that the best way to make the Fugitive Slave Act a dead letter was to make one or two dead kidnappers. And so there's this idea that violence is acceptable, is good, and is appropriate because the structures against which people are acting are unjust, fundamentally unjust. I think Robin, I see your point that the invasion or the attack on the Capitol on January 6th is an act of violence that was explicitly about politics and really about formal politics, about reshaping the political structure. So I think that is that's a more contemporary example of violence as politics in a way that I think is like bad and wrong. But that doesn't so it doesn't but I think it's also useful to understand the politics underlying that violence. Robin also asked, so what do the sources say about where Black folks in the early 1800s got their political ideas about citizenship? So I think that part of where this comes from is a general, so I think about this similarly to the way that I think about the fact that people like Samuel Cornish and the folks in the NYCV, that they were going to court and trying to use the legal system to change the circumstances of their lives. Black folks had to understand the law because they recognized that the law was the thing that was oppressing them. So African Americans come to understand and come to think about citizenship and the importance of citizenship in part because citizenship is in those debates in 1821 in New York, where state lawmakers were deciding to take away the right to vote from Black people. African Americans were people like Dred Scott, enslaved person who sues for his freedom in Missouri. He needs to try to understand the law because he understands that he is enslaved because the law says that slavery is a status in which he can be held. So I think broadly, the way that I think about this, there's a quotation that's at the beginning of my book that's from Thurgood Marshall from the 80s, I think, where he wrote that African Americans had been enslaved by law, disenfranchised by law, segregated by law, et cetera, and that now they're coming to win equality by law by the later 20th century. And I think that what that gets at is that African Americans needed to understand law and politics in really concrete ways because they recognized that that was the thing that was holding them back. And they thought that that would be, understanding the law would then be the best avenue for them to try to liberate themselves. So it was a really strategic choice that was based on a recognition of what the circumstances of Black life were. Yeah. How can I support current efforts to achieve racial justice for Black Americans? Sharing resources and education is key. Would you suggest more education about African American history, advocacy? So, you know, this is a question that I always struggle with because it's like, I think it's there's not a simple answer. You know, what can folks do to support people of color as they try to secure racial justice? I think, you know, the first thing that I would think is to go back to the point I was making about violence is like to try to be thoughtful about things that we might find shocking or surprising or upsetting, to try to sort of push back against a reflexive argument that like this thing is I think this is inappropriate and therefore it's wrong, and to be more sort of understanding and empathetic is a sort of a first important thing. But I also think that I don't know. I think one of the things that I think is important is, you know, the points you make about education are key. And I think that this is not just about educating oneself, but, you know, contributing to things like the public library, contributing to things like public radio, contributing to things like any sort of avenue that's going to allow more people who are deprived of opportunities for learning that some people might have access to expand access to knowledge, and also anything that's going to make sure people of color can continue to vote, because that's a major problem right now, the efforts to limit that. So and that's probably the most concrete thing is like, you know, send money to people who are supporting access to voting in states where that's being restricted or limited. This person asked, was the Black church significant in the development of Black politics? Absolutely. There are a couple of ways to think about that. One is that Black churches were spaces where African Americans, especially in the North, where they were able to come together and have sort of collective conversations. So, you know, I talked about the Black conventions as a thing like that, but Black conventions were just one sort of occasional way that happened. Black churches, every week, often several days a week, Black people would come together and have conversations. And those were not solely conversations about spirituality. They were conversations often, you know, one of the concepts in Black religion is this concept of like spiritual liberation. And a lot of folks would talk about more concrete, like earthly liberation in those spaces. Also, Black churches were like, if Black people had access to a physical building, that's useful. That's a place of shelter or refuge for Black folks. It's also a place for other kinds of meetings. A lot of Black conventions were actually held in Black churches. There's a moment that I write about in the same chapter where I talk about William Dixon in the 1850s, where the New York Committee of Vigilance holds a big anniversary celebration in a major Black church in New York City. And it's like a place where they're able to not only come together, but to use it as a base to make this really major political statement. Like, we are here, we are continuing to protect fugitive slaves, and we're going to keep doing that. So Black churches were, in a lot of ways, central to the, I don't know, like cultivating political leadership in political communities, but also to providing concrete political spaces for Black activism. Yeah, very, very important. All good?
Yeah, looks like you answered all the questions. Thank you so much.
That's my job.
Yeah.
Well, here's Ernestine with one that I just don't know anything. What do you know about Black landholdings in the current Adirondack Mountains? I don't know. I've thought a lot about trying to expand on the Willis Hodges story, but I haven't thought about avenues for it. But I think that is an interesting avenue for it. It's like, what happened to it? I know that actually Willis Hodges ended up going back to Virginia after the Civil War. So there you go. Thanks y'all for your thoughts and your questions. I really appreciate it.
And thank you, Dr. Bonner, on behalf of Howard County Library System for this enlightening presentation. And we thank you all for joining us in this shared learning experience and for your questions. If I'm gonna just share a survey, if you don't mind filling up the survey for us, we can bring you more of such classes. Just give a moment and I'm quickly gonna share the survey with you. And if you just fill out the survey again, thank you, Dr. Bonner, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great holiday.
Thanks, y'all. Take it easy. Be safe.
Bye.